The cost of building a home in Canada has never been higher, according to economists at RBC. The cost to build a home in Canada has gotten 51% more expensive over the last 3 years. According to their report published last week, much of the 51% increase in home building costs comes from soaring prices for steel, concrete, and lumber, along with rising labor costs and disruptions from extreme weather. Given the current state of Canada's housing market, economists and advocates have argued that this couldn't come at a worse time, right when provincial and municipal governments are seeking to ramp up home building. Joining us now to discuss how the cost to build a home impacts the housing market is Eric Lombardi, the founder of More Neighbours Toronto. Thank you for joining us today.
Thank you for having me on. A pleasure to be here.
So, we hear a lot about how zoning impacts the availability of housing, but we don't hear much about actual construction costs. How much of an impact do you think construction costs have on final home prices in comparison to other factors?
I think they have a significant cost, but I think the important thing for listeners to keep in mind here is that this is a system and all of these things have an impact on one another. So public policy around zoning and the rules to build housing impacts the ability and the incentives on labor, materials, and everything that you need to put into a home as well.
Are there outside factors as to why construction costs have soared, or are those increases in line with overall inflation?
Those key increases are not quite in line with overall inflation. We did have quite a supply shock through COVID, particularly to the movement of goods, especially lumber, over that period of time, and that did accelerate costs as well as the impacts to recover those things, especially when fuel prices spiked. And so a lot of those costs that during that time are baked into current prices. The other factor that we are facing right now is higher interest rates, which is just increasing the cost of capital for investing and building up of inventory. And so that's actually raising the costs for the industry as well.
So, if it costs more to build a home, one would assume that this discourages building. Are we seeing rising construction costs impact housing starts?
I think we are, but I think the mix of factors that are influencing this is all converging at the same moment in a very bad way for the production of new housing. Every time that you raise the price of inputs to housing, whether that be through materials and labor, or you do it through escalating land values or government taxes, fees, and processes costs, you raise the floor that a builder needs to pencil for that unit. And if the prices in the market can't sustain that floor, you're going to see less building overall. And so all of these things that add to the cost of a net new unit of housing influence whether or not we're going to build enough of it, particularly to meet the needs of our vastly and dramatically growing population.
Is the slowing down of housing starts a big problem for increasing supply, or is a slowdown cyclical?
I don't necessarily think this is cyclical. I think what we're experiencing now from a supply perspective means that prices years from now are really going to accelerate in ways that we've seen in the past, adding on top to the cost pressures that we're seeing from an affordability standpoint. So everything that we're seeing right now is just downstream of an escalating problem where the trend does not look good over the long term.
So, in your opinion, what are some of the best policies that can be enacted to calm the housing affordability crisis?
I think we need to address public policy around zoning and land use reform. We have a pretty bizarre way that we build out our cities in GTA and Canada generally, where we see very dense nodes of highly complex projects, that 20, 30, 40 stories. They take 5 to 10 years to build, and they're very engineering intensive per square foot that gets produced. They do produce a lot of smaller units, generally speaking, but it's still an expensive cost to bear. The other way that we've grown is that we've seen sprawling single family homes, et cetera, where you can build a lot lower at a cost per square foot perspective, but you don't produce a lot of units. And so public policy influences whether or not we can build what many call the missing middle. That is, the 4 to 8 story multiplexes to small apartment buildings that can be produced using less costly materials on faster timelines, so there's lower cost of capital and less risk. And you can leverage and have labor specialize even better to produce housing. So when we look at those policies, it doesn't just affect the price of land, it actually affects the ability for the industry's velocity to build net new housing and net new space with the resources it does have.